everyone! For today's video we're going to do a fun activity with diluting paint and dropping it onto a couple different surfaces. So I'm using some watercolor paper and bristle board. If you don't have that, no worries. You can use printer paper or cardstock and play around with the difference in quality of those papers. I'll demonstrate the difference between watercolor paper for this activity and bristle board. So you will need a few containers for your paint and a dropper, some paper, a paintbrush, and that should do it. So let's get started. Okay, so to get set up, I'm going to put about a dime-sized dollop of paint into each of these containers, maybe a little more generous with some, but not too much, just a little bit, goes a long way. And I ran out of containers, so for my orange, I'm going to just put it straight on my palette. And I'm going to grab my water and dilute it a little bit. So not a lot of water, a little bit goes a long way here, but you can always experiment with the different kinds of diluting you can do. I'm just using the end of my paintbrush here to mix around the paint, or else it would stay stuck to the bottom of the container. So you want to make sure that it is pretty evenly distributed in the water. And we're just going to go ahead and do that with all of them. And the orange on my palette, I'm going to just put some water from my dropper directly onto the palette and then swirl it around that way. Now I'm going to start with my watercolor paper. So that's what that sketchbook is right there, and I decided I'm going to paint it first with a layer of water from my brush. Okay, so now this is where it gets fun. I'm going to grab my dropper and make sure that there's no water remaining in the dropper itself, and I'm going to start with my lightest cerulean blue and load up my dropper with that blue and start dropping it onto my watercolor paper that I already diluted with water. And now I'm just going to have some fun, drop it around in different places, see what effect I'm getting from that, and then I'm going to start building on this and adding different colors. So before I add another color, I'm going to make sure that I clean my dropper out, and that's where my cup of water comes in handy here. I'm going to clean it out in here, and now I'm going to start adding some darker blues. Now that I'm feeling pretty happy with the way this page is looking, I'm going to move on and work on the next page of watercolor paper I have here. And keep experimenting. I really enjoy the way that the droplets of color mix with the paper after it's been diluted with water already. So I'm just going to see what happens when I start with my darker colors first. And if you notice, I'm working with a variety of blues, which is a monochromatic palette. We discussed this in our last video when I was really using an analogous palette. So when colors are touching each other on the color wheel, that is analogous. Monochrome is when we're using a variety of shades of the same color. So in this case, I chose blue. You can use black and white. And I'm adding a little splash of color later with this palette of orange. So just wanted to correct the difference between monochrome and analogous. Okay, so now I'm going to let the sketchbook set aside to dry and work on the bristle board. Over here I decided that I want to see what happens when I use the dropper directly without diluting the paper first, which might be a helpful thing to do if you're working with printer paper, since it doesn't have as strong integrity as the watercolor paper. So this part's pretty fun. I'm using the water in my cup to dilute it even more within the dropper, and I encourage you to just experiment and see what happens when you add a variety of water. So this is where we just have fun and see what happens. Like right now, I decided I just want to start scribbling around, and I'm going to make a pretty condensed amount of paint in my dropper so that I get a nice flow right here. So this is I'm gonna just have some fun with a little bit of scribbles and some drops and see what happens when I just keep working in the flow like this. Now that my watercolor paper has dried a little bit and I filled up my other pieces of paper, I'm gonna go back to my sketchbook and add some of my fun scribbly lines on here and just keep building, which is the really fun thing about this project is that as things dry, you can keep building and building and it just looks more, it creates more depth to the piece. So I hope you all have fun and that this gave you enough direction to experiment and play on your own. Don't forget to clean your dropper and your brushes.